The C-130 Hercules bucked and groaned, a beast of burden complaining about the thin, hostile air over the Zagros Mountains. Inside, the roar of its 4 Allison engines was a physical presence, vibrating through the thin metal of the fuselage and into the bones of its passengers. The cabin was a cramped, utilitarian tube of exposed wiring and webbed seating, smelling of jet fuel, stale coffee, and the nervous sweat of young men going to war. Most of those men belonged to the 7th Infantry, a fresh rotation heading to forward operating base Kestrel. They were loud, their boisterous energy a thin shield against the anxiety of their destination. Their laughter and jeers echoed off the metal walls, a desperate performance of invincibility. In seat 15A, a window seat with a view of nothing but a churning gray sky, Anya Petrova sat in perfect stillness. She was the only passenger in civilian attire. Practical cargo pants, sturdy boots, and a plain gray Henley that concealed a wiry, disciplined frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, sharp-featured and devoid of makeup, was a mask of placid observation. To the soldiers, she was an anomaly, a bureaucratic afterthought. They saw a woman in her late 30s, probably some kind of civilian contractor or desk-bound analyst, and their youthful arrogance filled in the rest. The mockery began subtly, a low murmur from the row behind her. "Look at her," a private named Miller hissed to his friend, Corporal Davies. "Bet she's from the State Department. Gonna teach us about cultural sensitivity while we're taking mortar fire," Davies snickered. "Geospatial analyst, I heard. Probably gets lost using Google Maps. Why do they even send them out here?" Their voices were just loud enough to carry, a deliberate act of exclusion. They saw her stillness as fear, her silence as weakness. Anya registered their words as she registered the drop in engine RPM from the number 3 engine. A faint but discernible shift in harmony. She did not turn. She did not react. Her focus was on the rivets in the fuselage wall, the way they strained with each bout of turbulence. She was cataloging the aircraft's stress points, an old and deeply ingrained habit. The conflict was plain. She was an outsider, deemed unfit for this environment by the very men she was meant to support. The turning point was still just a potential energy, a vibration in the airframe waiting for the right moment of mechanical failure to be released. She felt the plane lurch again, a sickening drop that silenced the soldiers' laughter for a full 10 seconds. Anya closed her eyes, not in fear, but to better feel the motion of the aircraft, to understand its language of distress. The mockery was just noise. The groaning of the airframe, however, was a signal. Colonel Marcus Thorne moved down the narrow aisle with the stiff-backed gait of a man who equated authority with rigidity. His uniform was immaculate. His jaw was granite, and his eyes, the color of faded steel, swept over the cabin with undisguised impatience. He was a man of action, a commander of infantry, and he had little time for passengers who did not carry a rifle. He stopped at seat 15A, his shadow falling over Anya. "Petrova," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the engine noise. He didn't wait for a response, just glanced at the tablet in his hand. "Anya Petrova, geospatial analyst," he said the title like it was a diagnosis of a terminal illness. Anya opened her eyes and met his gaze directly. "Colonel," her voice was calm, low, and carried no hint of deference or intimidation. It was simply a statement of fact. Thorne's lip curled slightly. "I read your file. Or what little of it they didn't classify as administrative. You're a long way from a satellite imagery lab, ma'am." The ma'am was a precision weapon, designed to infantilize and dismiss. "I'm aware of my location." Sir Thorne leaned closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial growl. "Let me be clear. FOB Kestrel is not a research facility. It is the sharp end of the spear. We are surrounded by hostiles on 3 sides and unforgiving terrain on the 4th. We have no room for liabilities. You will remain in the Command Operations Center. You will analyze your data, you will file your reports, and you will stay out of my soldiers' way. Is that understood?" His speech was practiced, a warning he likely gave to every non-combatant who passed through his command. He expected acquiescence, perhaps a flicker of fear. He received none. Anya's expression did not change. Her gaze remained steady. My role is to provide operational support, Colonel. I can't do that effectively if I'm confined to a single tent. I will go where the mission requires. Thorne's eyes narrowed. This was not the response he was accustomed to. He saw insubordination where she saw simple logic. Your mission, he stressed, his voice dropping another octave, is what I say it is. You are a civilian asset attached to my command. Your designation is support, not operational. Your opinion on the matter is irrelevant. He straightened up, his posture a clear dismissal. Enjoy the rest of your flight, Ms. Petrova. He turned and walked back toward the cockpit without a backward glance, leaving the weight of his disapproval hanging in the air. The soldiers behind her, having heard the exchange, renewed their quiet mockery. Told you, Miller whispered. Thinks she's here to run the show. Anya ignored them all. She turned her head back to the window, her mind moving past the colonel's petty display of power. She was thinking about the pitch of the engines, the subtle change in vibration, and the way the flight crew had been communicating in clipped, tense phrases over the internal comms for the last 10 minutes. The colonel was worried about her being a liability on the ground. He had no idea the real liability was the aircraft he was standing in. With the colonel gone, the cabin returned to its previous state of managed chaos. Anya, however, had retreated into a state of heightened perception. Her senses, honed by years of discipline most people could not imagine, began to deconstruct her environment with methodical precision. She wasn't just sitting in a plane. She was inhabiting a complex system, and her mind was mapping every component. Her eyes scanned the interior, not as a passenger, but as an operator. She noted the 2 primary emergency exits over the wings and the main ramp at the rear. She located the 3 fire extinguishers, noting their type, halon, suitable for electrical and fuel fires. She saw the emergency medical kits strapped to the forward bulkhead and mentally inventoried their likely contents. Tourniquets, pressure bandages, morphine syringes. Her gaze fell on the soldiers of the 7th. She observed the way they held their rifles, some with a casual familiarity, others with a white-knuckled tension that betrayed their inexperience. She saw the scuffs on their boots, the way their gear was packed, the small personal talismans some had attached to their body armor. She catalogued their faces, identifying the brash confidence of Private Miller, the followers' insecurity of Corporal Davies, and the quiet, watchful intelligence of another corporal sitting by the bulkhead, a young man named Jennings who met her gaze for a brief moment before looking away. Jennings, she noted, checked the seals on his helmet and the straps on his pack with an economy of motion that spoke of better training, or perhaps just a better understanding of the risks involved. Outside, the weather was worsening. She didn't need to see the clouds to know. She could feel it in the way the plane yawed and pitched. The turbulence was no longer the gentle rocking of a commercial flight. It was a series of sharp, jarring blows, as if the C-130 were being hammered by an invisible giant. The frequency of the plane's groans was increasing. She focused on the sound of the engines again, filtering out the laughter and the wind. The dissonance from the number 3 engine was more pronounced now, a gritty, uneven hum that fought against the smoother roar of the other 3. She could feel the vibration change, a tremor traveling up her spine that was distinct from the turbulence. It was the shudder of failing machinery. The flight crew's voices on the internal comm, previously tense, were now laced with a controlled urgency. She could only make out fragments, pressure drop, fluctuating oil temp, recommend shutdown. She closed her eyes and built a 3-dimensional map of the aircraft in her mind, placing herself, the soldiers, the crew, and the failing engine within it. She was no longer just a passenger. She was an observer, a processor of data, and she was preparing for the moment when observation would no longer be enough. The moment came without warning. A concussive bang, like a thunderclap inside the cabin, echoed through the fuselage. It was followed by a violent, sickening lurch to the right as the number 3 engine finally gave out, its propeller auto-feathering with a grinding shriek. The lights in the cabin flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the interior into a disorienting darkness. They were replaced a second later by the hellish, pulsating red of the emergency lighting. Panic, a wild and contagious animal, was instantly uncaged. The young soldiers who had been laughing moments before were now shouting in fear. One of them began to pray loudly. Another was simply screaming. The aircraft was now in a steep, uncontrolled bank, its single functioning wing on the right side struggling to keep them aloft. Gravity became a malevolent force, pulling everyone and everything toward the left side of the cabin. Loose helmets and water bottles skittered across the floor. Through the roar of the wind and the terrified shouts, the pilot's voice, strained and metallic, crackled over the loudspeaker. "Brace for impact. I repeat, brace for impact." Colonel Thorne was on his feet, trying to shout orders, to restore discipline, but his voice was swallowed by the chaos. "Hold on. Everyone stay in your seats." His authority, so absolute moments before, had evaporated. Fear was in command now. Anya felt the G-forces pressing her into her seat, but her mind remained a pocket of absolute calm in the storm of hysteria. Her heart rate, which she could monitor as easily as a timepiece, remained steady. This was not a new sensation. The fear, the noise, the imminent possibility of death. It was a familiar operating environment. She watched as a pallet of critical communications equipment, secured near the rear of the cabin, began to strain against its cargo straps. The violent maneuvers had caused the load to shift. One of the straps, improperly tightened before takeoff, a detail she had noted earlier, snapped with a sharp crack like a rifle shot. The heavy pallet, weighing over a ton, slid several inches, its metal edge groaning against the fuselage wall. If it broke free entirely, it would rip through the side of the plane like a can opener, causing explosive decompression and sealing their fate. The loadmaster, a young airman with terror in his eyes, fumbled with another strap, his hands shaking too badly to secure it. The crisis was escalating, a cascade of failures that would end in a fireball against a mountainside. While the cabin descended into chaos, Anya moved. She unbuckled her harness with a single, fluid motion, the muscle memory of 1,000 similar actions overriding the violent pitching of the aircraft. She rose from her seat, her body instinctively compensating for the shifting center of gravity, her feet finding purchase on the tilting deck as if she were born to it. She moved not with speed, but with a chilling economy of purpose. Every step was deliberate, every movement conserved energy. She was a panther navigating a collapsing jungle. The panicked soldiers saw her as a blur of motion against the strobing red lights. Colonel Thorne, bracing himself against a bulkhead, watched her with disbelief. He saw her move past the terrified loadmaster, her face an unreadable mask of concentration. The communications pallet slid again, groaning ominously. It was moments from breaking free. Anya ignored the complex ratchet straps the airman had been fumbling with. They were too slow, too complicated for a situation this dynamic. Instead, she grabbed the loose end of a heavy nylon cargo strap dangling from the ceiling. Her hands, which had appeared unremarkable just minutes ago, moved with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. She looped the strap around a reinforced stanchion on the floor, her body a fulcrum of leverage. Then she tied a knot. It was not a simple knot. It was a complex, interlocking series of loops and hitches known as a transport knot, a technique used in high-altitude mountaineering and special operations rigging to secure heavy loads under extreme tension. It was a knot designed to tighten under pressure, to use the object's own weight against itself. Her fingers worked with a surgeon's dexterity, pulling, looping, and tightening in a sequence that took less than 5 seconds to complete. She cinched it tight, the nylon groaning as it bit into the metal frame of the pallet, securing it just as the plane hit another pocket of turbulence. The pallet held. Having averted the immediate structural threat, she turned her attention to the human element. Private Miller, the soldier who had been most vocal in his mockery, was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with terror, his hands clawing at his chest. Anya moved to his side. She didn't shout. She didn't grab him. She leaned in close, her voice a low, anchoring hum beneath the chaos. "Look at me, Private," she said, her tone devoid of judgment. "Breathe with me. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4-inch, she began to breathe in a slow, deliberate cadence. Miller, lost in his fear, didn't seem to hear. Anya placed 2 fingers on the side of his neck, finding his carotid artery. "I can feel your pulse," she said calmly. "It's too fast. Slow it down. Breathe with me." The physical contact, the undeniable certainty in her voice, broke through his panic. His eyes focused on hers. He started to match her breathing. In, hold. The rhythm was a lifeline in the swirling vortex of fear. He was calming down. Anya had restored order to her small corner of the chaos, not through authority, but through sheer, undeniable competence. The pilots, freed from the distraction of a potential fuselage breach and with their aircraft now marginally more stable, managed to wrestle the C-130 into a controlled descent. They were still losing altitude at an alarming rate, but it was a glide now, not a plummet. Below them, through breaks in the clouds, the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Zargos Range were terrifyingly close. The metallic voice of the pilot crackled over the comms again, strained but professional. "Emergency landing at FOB Kestrel. 5 minutes out." Brace, the cabin fell into a tense, adrenaline-fueled silence. The raw panic had subsided, replaced by a grim understanding of their situation. In that silence, all eyes turned to the woman in seat 15A. She had returned to her seat and was buckled in, her posture as serene as it had been at the start of the flight. But everything had changed. The soldiers who had mocked her were now staring at her with a mixture of awe and shame. Private Miller, his breathing now steady, avoided her gaze, his face flushed with embarrassment. Corporal Jennings, the quiet observer, watched her openly, his expression one of profound curiosity. He had seen the knot she tied, had seen the way she moved. That wasn't an analyst. That was something else entirely. Colonel Thorne stood near the cockpit door, his knuckles white where he gripped a handhold. His mind was reeling. He had dismissed her as a bureaucrat, a liability. But he had just watched that liability prevent a catastrophic failure with a level of skill and composure he had rarely seen even in his most seasoned non-commissioned officers. He replayed her actions in his mind. The way she diagnosed the problem with the pallet, her decisive movement, the impossible speed and precision of her hands. The knot. It wasn't just a random knot. It was a solution, elegant and brutally effective. He was a man who understood the geometry of violence, of action and consequence. And he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that what he had just witnessed was the work of a professional. Not a professional analyst. A professional of a different, more dangerous and far more disciplined kind. The derisive ma'am he had used earlier now tasted like ash in his mouth. The entire power dynamic of the flight had been inverted. Anya Petrova had not raised her voice, had not issued a single command. She had simply acted. And in doing so, she had quietly, irrevocably taken control. The question was no longer if she belonged here. The question, now burning in Thorne's mind and in the eyes of every soldier on that plane, was who, or what exactly was she? The landing was a controlled crash. The C-130 hit the gravel runway of FOB Kestrel hard, bouncing once, twice, before the screech of abused tires and the roar of reverse thrusters from the remaining engines brought it to a shuddering halt. Emergency crews were already swarming the aircraft before the ramp even lowered. The soldiers disembarked quickly, their faces pale but relieved, casting nervous glances back at Anya as they went. Once on the ground, however, it was clear the crisis was far from over. The base was in a state of high, but strangely quiet, alert. There was no incoming fire, no sound of explosions. The threat was invisible, insidious. Colonel Thorne was met on the tarmac by a frantic-looking major, his communications officer. "Sir, we're deaf and blind," the major said, forgoing all pleasantries. "All long-range comms are down. Our satellite uplink is feeding us garbage data. Drone feeds are ghosting, we're seeing enemy patrols that aren't there, and our real-time feeds are frozen. The perimeter sensors are cycling in a useless diagnostic loop. It's a full-spectrum electronic warfare attack, but like nothing I've ever seen. It's not jamming. It feels more like the entire network has been hijacked. Thorne's face hardened, his mind instantly shifting from the immediate crisis of the flight to the new, more complex threat. He and the Major strode toward the Command Operations Center, COC, a large, semi-permanent tent filled with humming servers and banks of monitors. Anya followed a few paces behind, her presence an unspoken question. Inside the COC, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Technicians typed frantically at keyboards, their faces illuminated by screens filled with cascading lines of code and corrupted satellite images. The base's chief electronic warfare officer, a young but brilliant captain named Eva Rostova, looked exhausted. "I can't isolate the source, sir," she said to Thorne, her voice tight with frustration. "It's not a brute force attack. The signal is polymorphic. It changes its signature every time we try to lock it down. It's woven into our own encryption. It's like a ghost in the machine." Thorne stared at the chaotic data streams, his fists clenched. This was the prelude to an assault. Their enemy was blinding them, sowing confusion, preparing the battlefield for a physical attack that could come from any direction. He was out of his depth, a man of infantry tactics facing a war of algorithms and frequencies. His gaze swept the tent and landed on Anya, who was standing quietly by the entrance, her eyes scanning the screens with an unnerving intensity. He remembered his own dismissive words. "You will analyze your data." It was a moment of bitter irony. Desperation and a flicker of grudging respect made his decision for him. He barked at her, his voice rough with frustration. "Petrova, you're an analyst. Analyze this." It was not a request. It was a challenge, a test thrown down in the middle of a battle she was never meant to be a part of. He was pushing her onto the field, half expecting, half hoping she would fail, just to restore his own sense of order. Anya stepped forward, moving into the heart of the chaos with the same unnerving calm she displayed on the plane. She didn't go to the main console. She didn't ask Captain Rostova for a summary. Instead, she walked to a secondary station, one that displayed the raw signal data, the unprocessed noise coming from their satellite receivers. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening not with her ears, but with a different sense, to the rhythm of the static, the cadence of the corrupted data packets. The technicians and officers watched her, their skepticism warring with the memory of what she had done on the C-130. Captain Rostova started to explain her methodology. "We've been trying to apply standard counterjamming protocols, but the encryption is." Anya held up a hand, a simple, silencing gesture that Rostova, surprisingly, obeyed. "You're looking for a ghost," Anya said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the tense tent. "But you're fighting the house it's haunting. The attack isn't the signal. The signal is just a symptom." She pointed to a tiny, almost imperceptible recurring data fragment in the stream of noise. "There. That's the carrier wave. It's not polymorphic. It's algorithmic. It's designed to mimic the background radiation of our own systems." A digital parasite. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up diagnostic screens Rostova hadn't even thought to check. "They're not trying to break your encryption. They've piggybacked a microvirus onto the handshake protocol of your uplink. It latched on the last time you downloaded a satellite weather update. It's not jamming you from the outside. It's corrupting your data from the inside. It's creating a recursive feedback loop. You're not blind. You're trapped in a hall of mirrors." The explanation was so clear, so precise. It silenced the room. Rostova stared at her screen, her eyes wide with dawning comprehension. She had been fighting a frontal assault, but the enemy had already breached the walls. How? How do we stop it?" Rostova asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You can't," Anya said flatly. "Not by fighting it. You have to starve it. Isolate the primary server from the network. Take it completely offline. Then broadcast a null-frequency pulse on a dedicated channel. Use the old emergency band, 405 MHz. The virus is coded to ignore low-tech frequencies. The pulse will force it to try and reboot its handshake protocol. When it does, it will be exposed for exactly 17 seconds. In that window, you can purge it." It was an audacious, incredibly high-risk maneuver. It was also delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who wasn't guessing. It was clear she had seen this or something very much like it before. Colonel Thorne stared at her, his face a mask of stone. The woman he had dismissed as a desk jockey had just dissected a sophisticated electronic warfare attack in under 2 minutes. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Geospatial analyst." Is a lie. Anya finally turned from the console to face him, her expression unreadable. "My name is Anya Petrova. Service number 7348210 Alpha. I was attached to the Special Activities Division. My current status is inactive reserve." Seconded to the DIA, Thorne's eyes widened slightly at the mention of the SAD, the CIA's clandestine paramilitary wing. He turned to his aide. "Run that service number. Now." Highest priority clearance, the aide scrambled to a secure terminal. A few moments later, he turned back, his face ashen. He didn't speak. He simply turned the screen toward the colonel. The file was almost entirely blacked out with digital redactions. Entire decades of her life were missing, replaced by impenetrable blocks of text. But at the top, next to her name and service number, one field remained, stark and clear. Contained a single word. Call sign, Vodianoi. The name hung in the air of the COC, heavy and absolute. Vodianoi. To most, it would mean nothing. But in the rarefied air of military intelligence and special operations, it was a name spoken only in whispers. It was a ghost story, a legend used to frighten rookie intelligence officers. The Vodianoi was not a person but a phenomenon. A myth attached to a string of impossible successes in the darkest corners of global conflict. Wet work in hostile capitals, deep cover sabotage, extractions from impenetrable prisons. The Vodianoi was the operator sent when all other options had failed, a scalpel wielded in the shadows by the highest echelons of national security. A weapon, not a soldier, and certainly not a geospatial analyst. Colonel Thorne felt a cold dread mix with a sudden, shocking clarity. He looked at Anya, at her calm demeanor and unassuming clothes, and finally saw her. He wasn't looking at a civilian contractor. He was looking at a living legend. At that moment, the door to the COC opened and Major Croft, the commander of the A-15 detachment stationed at the FOB, strode in. The A-15s were the base's resident Tier 1 unit, a team of elite operators who answered to a different chain of command entirely. Croft was a man carved from the same granite as Thorne, but his eyes held the quiet, lethal focus of a true predator. "Colonel," he began. "My team picked up on the chatter about the EW attack. What's the—" He trailed off as he saw the secure terminal screen, still displaying Anya's file. He saw the call sign. Croft's professional mask didn't just crack. It shattered. His entire body language shifted. The relaxed posture of a superior officer entering a subordinate's command center vanished. His back straightened into a rigid plank. His heels snapped together with a sound like a breaking bone. He raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute, his eyes locked on Anya. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with a respect that bordered on reverence. Behind him, the rest of his A-15 team, who had followed him to the tent, saw their commander's reaction. They saw the call sign on the screen. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, they mirrored their commander. In perfect unison, the 8 hardened operators, men who feared nothing and respected few, snapped to the position of attention. The sound of their boots hitting the concrete floor in a single, sharp report was a thunderclap in the silent tent. They were not saluting Colonel Thorne. They were not acknowledging the other officers. They were standing to attention for the quiet woman in seat 15A. For Vodianoi, the soldiers from the 7th Infantry, including Miller and Jennings, who had gathered outside the COC to see what was happening, witnessed the entire scene. The sight of the legendary A-15s standing at rigid attention for the woman they had mocked was a lesson in humility more profound than any drill sergeant could ever deliver. The electronic crisis was averted. Following Anya's precise instructions, Captain Rostova purged the virus and restored the base's systems. The Hall of Mirrors shattered, and FOB Kestrel could once again see and hear the enemy that was massing in the hills. The impending attack was still a threat, but now it was a known quantity, a battle they could fight. In the aftermath, Colonel Thorne approached Anya. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a stiff, formal humility that was clearly unnatural for him. "Ms. Petrova," he struggled with the words. "Your actions on the aircraft and here, I was wrong. I apologize." Anya simply nodded, accepting the apology without comment. It was irrelevant. The mission was all that mattered. She had no interest in his approval, only in his cooperation. She left the stuffy confines of the COC, seeking the clean, cold air of the mountain night. She found a quiet spot near the perimeter fence, a place where the generator's hum was distant and the vast, star-dusted sky felt close enough to touch. She stood with her back to the base, a solitary figure looking out at the jagged silhouettes of the Zagros range. This was her element, not the adulation or the fear in the eyes of others, but the quiet contemplation of a hostile landscape, the analysis of a tactical problem. The respect she had just received was a tool, nothing more. It would grant her the access and freedom of movement she needed to complete her real mission, the one that was far more complex than fixing a broken plane or a compromised network. She felt a presence behind her and turned to see Major Croft. He didn't speak. He held out a steaming, insulated mug. Coffee. It was a simple gesture, but in the silent language of his world, it was the ultimate sign of acceptance. Peace offering. An acknowledgement that they were the same tribe. Anya took the mug, her fingers brushing his. She nodded her thanks. He nodded back, then melted back into the shadows, leaving her to her thoughts. She took a sip of the hot, bitter liquid, its warmth a small comfort against the encroaching cold. She was no longer just Anya Petrova, the mocked analyst in seat 15A. She was Vodianoy, a name that carried the weight of 100 hidden battles. But as she stood there, watching the moon rise over enemy territory, she was neither. She was simply a woman with a job to do, her dignity intact, her purpose clear. The respect was earned, the mockery forgotten. All that remained was the mission, and the quiet, unyielding competence of the woman sent to see it through.